Welcome back, math friends. Today we're looking at lesson 2.5, and lesson 2.5 covers multiplication of real numbers. And so we're going to be focusing mainly on multiplying positives and negatives so that you'll understand how to do that. Now, the rules for multiplication are like this. Multiplication simply is repeated addition, because 3 times 4 is just the same thing as adding 3 4 times, and that's 12, right? Now, negative 3 times 4, that's the same thing as adding negative 3 4 times, and that would be negative 12. Now, this is where it starts to get weird, because when we multiply negative 3 times negative 4, that's the same thing as the opposite of negative 3 4 times, and that gives us positive 12. And multiplying 3 times negative 4 is the same thing as multiplying the opposite of 3 added to itself 4 times, which gives us negative 12. Now, if that sounds confusing, I understand. So let's just talk about the basics. When you multiply two factors, okay, and factors are the things that you are multiplying together. That's what factors are. You multiply factors to create a product. So a factor times a factor equals a product. That might be something important for you to write down. Anyway, so let's look at it this way. If you multiply a positive times a positive, you get a positive. If you multiply a negative times a negative, you also get a positive. However, if you multiply a positive times a negative, the product is negative. Or if you multiply a negative times a positive, the answer, the product, is negative. And so simply, with that, if the signs of the two factors are the same, so if they're both positive or both negative, the product will be positive. So positive times positive equals positive. Negative times negative equals positive. Write this stuff down. It's important. And then, if the signs of the two factors are different, the product will be negative. So positive times negative equals negative. Negative times positive equals negative. If the signs are different, your answer, your product will always be negative. That's the important thing to remember when we're multiplying positive and negative numbers. Now, if you're multiplying more than two factors, because sometimes we multiply 3, 4, 5 different numbers altogether, especially if we have exponents, here's the thing you want to remember. If there is an even number of negative factors, so if you're looking at all these things that you're multiplying together, and there's an even number of negative factors, the product's going to be positive. Okay? That's just the bottom line. Even number of negative factors, the product will be positive. Remember, in even numbers, even is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. Now, on the other side of that, if there is an odd number of negative factors, your product is going to be negative. So odd numbers like 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, those are all odd numbers. If you have an odd number of negative factors, the numbers that are being multiplied together, the answer will be negative. All of this stuff is really important for you to write down, so if you need to pause the video and do so, I highly recommend it. Now let's take a look at some examples. Right? First of all, we got negative 3 times positive 4 times negative 2. How many negative signs do you see? I see 2 of them. That means we're going to have a positive product. And so now all we have to do is multiply the factors. 3 times 4 is 12, times 2 is 24. Positive 24. Let's look at the next one. Oh, we're multiplying negative 1/2 times negative 2 times negative 3. There are 3 negatives there. That's an odd number of negatives. Odd number of negatives. So that means your answer is going to be negative. And 1/2 times 2 is 1, and 1 times 3 is 3. So our answer is negative 3. Now look at this next one here. This is negative 1. Notice the parentheses, negative 1 to the 4th power. So that means you're going to be multiplying -1 times -1 times -1 times -1. How many negatives are there? There's 4. That's an even number. So that's an even number of negatives. That means it's going to be a positive answer. So our answer is going to be +1. Now this next one, you'll notice there is no parentheses. And that's important because if there's no parentheses, what that's saying is this is the opposite of 1 to the 4th power. If the parentheses aren't there, that's what that negative sign means. The opposite of 1 to the 4th power. Now 1 to the 4th power, so we're the opposite of 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, because that's 1 to the 4th power. 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is just 1. And then we take the opposite of that, so that's going to be -1. Now let's take a look at when we have variables with numbers. Let's look here. -2 times -x. Well, there's 2 negatives there. That's an even number, so that's going to be positive 2x. Let's look at this next one here. Now this is 3 times -n times -n times -n. How many negatives are there? There's 3 of them. That's an odd number of negatives. So your answer is going to be negative because it's an odd number of negative signs. And that's 3n to the 3rd power because we're multiplying n times itself 3 times the 3. Okay, let's look at the next one here. This is -1 times -2 to the 2nd power. So that's going to be -1 times -a times -a, right? How many negative signs are there? There are 3, because -a in parentheses squared is -a times -a. So we have a total of 3 negative signs. So our answer is going to be negative. And that's going to be -a squared, and we have to put that into parentheses. Yeah, okay. All right, now let's take a look at the properties of multiplication. These are important. They're just like addition, the properties of addition. The commutative property says that if you multiply -1 times 3, that's the same thing as multiplying 3 times -1. You can reverse the order and it doesn't make any difference. Commutative property. The associative property says if we're multiplying 3 numbers all together, -2 times 4 times 5, and we multiply these 2 together first, that's that we could do the same thing. We could multiply -2 times 4 times 5, and we can do -4 times 5 first, and it won't make any difference. It won't change the answer. So multiplication, the order doesn't matter. Now the identity property of multiplication is you can multiply any number times 1, and you'll get that same number. For example, 8 times 1 is always going to be 8. That's the identity property of multiplication. The zero property of multiplication says if you multiply any number times 0, your answer will be 0. So -11 times 0 is going to be 0. 102 times 0 is going to be 0. It's just how it works. Any number times 0 is 0. And then the opposites property. The product of any number and -1 is the opposite of that number. So if I multiply 7 times -1, I'm going to get -7. And the opposite of that is true. If I multiply -7 times -1, my answer will be 7, which is the opposite of the number I started with, the factor I started with. So now let's take a look at a couple of problems where we're evaluating the expression where we use x equals -5. So this would be this first one, -4 times -1 times -x, or the opposite of x. So this would be -4 times -1 Now the opposite of negative 5 is 5. So that becomes 5. How many negative signs are there? There's 2, so our answer is going to be positive. 4 times 1 is 4, and 4 times 5 is 20. Positive 20. All right. Let's look at this next one here. Negative 9.7 times x times negative 2. So this is negative 9.7 times negative 5 times negative 2. Now I can multiply negative 9.7. Now how many negative signs do we have? There are 3. So we know our answer is going to be negative. So all we have to do is figure out 9.7 times 5. And that's 48.5. We multiply that times 2. And that's 97. But it'll be negative 97 because of the 3 negative signs. It's an odd number of negatives. And that's all there is. The video ran a little long. I apologize for that, but here's your practice work. And there you go. Now you can find this practice work in the slide where you found this video, and you can print it or copy it from there, or you can pause the video and copy it from here. Either way, it doesn't matter. Have a great day. Don't forget to be awesome, and I'll see you next time.